Hello, everybody. Welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Today's episode deals with subjects in school violence, school shootings, and bullying. If you or anybody you know is thinking about harming themselves and you need somebody to talk to, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Feel free to reach out to the show if you want to talk to us. We're at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at Mercado Airwaves @gmail.com. And again, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. This subject is very sensitive, and we tried our best to make sure we kept that in mind as we did this episode. So with all that in mind, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the show. Welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Joining us today to talk about school violence, school bullying, and school shootings is friend of the show, author Dr. Stephen Webb. You can check out his book at the best-selling book on Amazon, Education in a Violent World. That's Amazon.com, and just search Education in a Violent World. It is a very sensitive subject, and we learned a lot in this episode. So hopefully we did right by you, we did right by the community, and hopefully we all learned something on this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. But before we get to Dr. Stephen Webb, we want to remind you that you can follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can email this show and give us any ideas of subjects you would like us to talk about on Outreach Radio Chicago by sending us an email at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com. You can also get the podcast version of all our shows on Outreach Radio Chicago and everything else that we're doing outside of the station at Mercado Airwaves, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And while you're at it, please like, rate, review, and share the program. And finally, like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Coming up next here on Outreach Radio Chicago, author of best-selling book Education in a Violent World is Dr. Stephen Webb to talk all things safety in public schools and our children. That's next here on Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm Mike Mercado. Thank you for keeping it with us here on Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. And joining us today is friend of the show, Dr. Stephen Webb. You can check out his book on Amazon at Education in a Violent World. Doc, how you doing? Thank you for joining us here on Outreach Radio Chicago.
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
It's really interesting that we really get a chance to talk to you at this point of the year when we have kids right now in the city of Chicago who are in school and are always facing different type of threats, whether it comes from classmates, whether it comes from total strangers outside of the world. And we're going to tackle a lot of different subjects just like that. But before we get into that, Doc, can you give the audience of Chicago a little bit information about yourself?
Sure. This is my 26th year as a school administrator from the southern part of Illinois. I've been a law enforcement officer since 2010. I'm a certified Alice active shooter instructor and a Raider solo engagement for law enforcement instructor. I speak all over the nation on school safety and just finished my first book then in November based on years of research. To tell you the truth, this is a time in our lives when most people would be looking at education as what's going to be our next Common Core, our next curricular decision, our next national policy. And my focus is on that next child. And whenever they enter my doors, what kind of baggage are they bringing with them?
Now, what got you into this field? Because I know for a lot of people, obviously, when it deals with children, they really want to get involved. But what was it that really drove you to not just be part of the activism that is gun violence and knowledge and prevention, but to actually get involved with law enforcement?
School safety has been such an important topic for me, probably based back when I was the principal and the Heath High School shooting took place. And one of my teachers, her child was in that school at that prayer group when the shooting occurred. And, of course, that trauma stayed with me, and I started researching school safety pretty heavily at that point. But we tried, whenever I became superintendent here in this current school district, we employed a couple of school resource officers to put that zero response guy or gal with a weapon in our building, because we're so rural, there's no telling what type of response we might receive in terms of time, and it just didn't work out. One got a better job, one didn't work out as a proper SRO. So I went to the academy myself, and dealing with the society as a whole has really opened my eyes to what we're experiencing in our schools.
Now, when you are witnessing what is going on around you in society and you're training yourself and you're learning all these different ways that kids are being attacked these days, what was one of those moments that really was the light bulb on top of the head where you knew that this was a different type of beast than necessarily parents and adults were dealing with in the 90s and the 80s when it comes to the social media, when it comes to just the online bullying that a lot of kids are seeing and a lot of the other type of mediums that are used outside of creativity and exercise that people can distract themselves with? What was that big moment that you realized that this was a different beast you're dealing with now?
There's been all kinds of moments at the school, but last year, let's just take last year for example. There were 26 school shootings, and we probably heard about every single shooting by media, by national media. But at the same time, there were thousands of young people who committed suicide. Now, where is the outrage to that? That is a direct correlation to what we're seeing in violence in our schools. And I guess one of the times that really hit hard with me, I guess twice, I've been asked to actually shoot somebody because they wanted to commit suicide by cop. Wow. Twice in a small rural area. And they were very much hooked on opiates, and one was just willing to be shot in order to save his black tar heroin. And I know they had children, or found out that they had children. And knowing that those children were living in those houses, there was a study in 2012 that found that almost half of America's children have suffered at least one childhood trauma before the age of 18. Half. So if that's 50% of the kids coming in that have had some type of child trauma before they walked in your door, and then we expect them to be educated just like we educated kids in the 1950s in classes that have too many kids in them. The class sizes are too large. We've got one teacher. It's difficult to get that stimulation on that kid that they're used to at their home and in the environment and all of the pressures that they've got. We've got to do a better job at analyzing each individual child and look at differentializing their education for them, not for a herd of kids like we've been doing in the past. Times are different. Their experiences are different. We need to change.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode, but before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Today's episode deals with subjects in school violence, school shootings, and bullying. If you or anybody you know is thinking about harming themselves and you need somebody to talk to, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Feel free to reach out to the show if you want to talk to us. We're at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. And again, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. The subject is very sensitive, and we tried our best to make sure we kept that in mind as we did this episode. So with all that in mind, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the show. So when you're dealing with the individual and not just the entire group, and I think that's a really interesting point to make because everybody is different, and we do realize that, medicine in generality is not great for the individual. And what have you found personally to be able to work for you when it comes to connecting to a lot of these kids that might have violent thoughts or might have suicidal thoughts? What has been kind of that breakthrough moment for you in an individual level that you've noticed when trying to help these kids?
Well, a very disturbing fact is that now in our world today, 1 in 5 high school boys have been diagnosed with ADHD, and 1 in 11. Think about the number of kids. Over half of these kids will then be prescribed some type of heavy dose of psychotic medicine. And these are the kids, like Ritalin or Adderall. These are the kids that are coming into our school, and these are kids whose brains are developing, their behaviors are developing, and we're giving them pills to try to change their behavior. That's the world we're in today. So if you take those kids and you take them from a highly stimulated environment of video gaming and phones and YouTube and put them into our schools, you've got to connect them with your school and with your community because they're disconnected and only connected by Wi-Fi to most of their social groups. And in order to do that, you can't set them in a classroom if they're dealing with attention deficit and expect them to behave just like what you might consider the norm. We have to design our schools and design the way we teach these kids to look at what they need in terms of social emotional learning and work on that because this is one of the few social gatherings where they're actually with humans is at their schools because they spend all night long in a social networking area with all kinds of people and received all kinds of trauma. And then all of a sudden they get around humans in our school and we expect them to be like the kids of the 1950s. So one of the things I found, I'm one of those people that think 100% of our kids ought to be involved in something extracurricular in our schools because it's about building relationships, building that connectivity. And if you get them with someone who loves them, someone who nurtures them, doing something that they want to do, and I'm always looking for a new extracurricular activity to add. I believe that's money well spent in order to get kids involved in after-school activities and not on those other super stimulating social networks.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode. But before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Today's episode deals with subjects in school violence, school shootings, and bullying. If you or anybody you know is thinking about harming themselves and you need somebody to talk to, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Feel free to reach out to the show if you want to talk to us. We're at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. And again, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. The subject is very sensitive, and we tried our best to make sure we kept that in mind as we did this episode. So with all that in mind, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the show. Dr. Stephen Webb joins us today on Outreach Radio Chicago. He is the author of the Amazon best-selling book, Education in a Violent World. I hope you guys check that out after we have this conversation. It's some great stuff by Dr. Webb. You know, Doc, I wanted to hit on this. You were talking about the stimulant and being able to reach these children, how important it is to in the individual level. Let's talk a little bit about the adults in this situation, the teacher, the parents, the doctor themselves. It ranges from age, and we have young parents, older parents. We have younger teachers, older teachers. Same thing with doctors, and same thing with just everyday people, all walks of life. How important is it to have patience when dealing with some of these individual children, adolescents, teenagers, because of the trauma they're dealing with outside of the place that they're in? How important is it to practice patience and checking that frustration?
Well, it should be the primary importance. But right now, especially in the state of Illinois, the primary importance is to add mandates, some type of curricular environment, and add it into their classes. So they've got to take now 4 years of English and 3 years of math, and on and on. And it's squeezing out those vocational classes and those arts and music and those things that kids enjoy doing, because there are some kids that are just not going to go to college. And getting society to quit standardizing all of these tests and trying to define what a normal kid is very difficult, because we all the decision makers, grew up in the 70s and the 80s, or when this was our social mecca. This was our place. We may have had college on the mind. A lot of these kids don't. And what do we have for them when we continue to put curricular mandates on top of them? Listen, we're talking about at least 36. There's a study by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. They found that at least 36 school shootings or other acts of violence were committed by those taking some type of psychiatric drug. And I get it. When I'm sick, I like to go get something from the doctor to fix me. But we're talking about children whose brains are developing. And when we bring them into this environment, and we can't provide them something that stimulates it, something that they want to do, we're providing them things they have to do in order to make society believe that they're a good student. Then I think we've lost our way now. We don't have church on Sunday is not the place where we go to see all of our friends anymore. They're seeing their friends all night long. And with that, they also can't leave the school district and leave the bullying behind. It follows them everywhere they go. So we've had changes all over the place outside of school. Why aren't we changing our schools?
That lasting impact of knowing that you cannot get away. There was a time, you are so right. There was a time, I'm only 29. There was a time where I was able to check out of school. I was able to go play sports. I was able to hang out with my brothers, my family, and whatever problems you had, you were able to check out for just a little bit, not run away from, but able to get some kind of, relief and a vacation from. But you're right, it's with you 24/7, whether you're on Instagram, Snapchat, whether you're anywhere, it doesn't matter. People find a way, especially these teenagers and these kids who are so much smarter than us when it comes to this technology. I think it's a fascinating point you bring up, Doc. And we are speaking with Dr. Stephen Webb here on Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We really appreciate you guys making us a part of your day. Make sure you check out the book, Education in a Violent World. You should be going on Amazon.com right now and ordering that bad boy as we are talking to the good doc himself. I have some points I want to get into, Doc, that I find interesting, and I don't know how to come at this without being critical, but more along of curious. We were talking about how you've done your training, you're part of law enforcement, you're part of the research. When we look at Parkland, for example, and I know it's a touchy subject, but when we look at general school shootings, even though they all are so different with all their similarities, for example, Parkland and these shootings in general, what are some errors made before the attack and during the attack and post-attack? I know it's a mouthful question, but what did we miss during these times?
Well, we've talked for several minutes now about children, about those mental issues that are happening within our walls.
Mm-hmm.
Those keep me awake at night. But Parkland, we learned so much from these school shootings in the past. We learn from them. I go and I speak about them. People will go and they will try to fix a few things, but then we start getting back into human complacency. And that's our biggest threat, is not learning, not hearing the alarms in our brain and acting on them. So let's talk about Parkland for a minute. I visited Parkland this summer. I wanted to interview people. And I interviewed a man that is in the neighboring town. His child is in a neighboring school. And his response when I asked him about the Parkland shooting was, I can't believe it happened there. It should have happened at my kid's school because this is the rich school. So think about that just a minute. This is where the rich kids go, he said. This school right here had a great plan. They had a great plan. They had a guy that's outside on a golf cart checking all the parking lots during the day, and he identified this person as soon as he got out of the car. He knew who he was. He knew he shouldn't be there. Saw the rifle bag, identified it as a potential rifle bag, contacted another security person inside Building 12 where this Nicholas Cruz was headed and let him know that he was coming. He started to go up and address him, and at no time did they call a lockdown. And those alarms in their heads say, let's alert the school that this is occurring. They just had a conversation back and forth about why was Nicholas here. And even the inside security guard did not address him before the rifle came out of the bag.
Wow.
He walked towards him and then turned around and walked back up the other stairs, was going to meet him on the second floor. Again, no lockdown called. They had all kinds of alerts in their head. They just didn't allow, they rationalized that. So in the triune brain, and I talk about this quite often in my para mindset, you've got the survival mode, you've got the emotional mode, and then you've got the thinking mode. And they never got it to the thinking mode and said, hey, let's lock it down, find out what's going on here, and address this before it's too late, because they wanted to rationalize why he was there. Biggest mistake that they made was when he first got out of that car and they didn't call a lockdown. It would have been saved if those kids would have not walked out in that hallway. They've got some safety issues with that school district. I walked around it. They've got buildings that are separated, and that causes a problem.
Wow.
That means the doors have to be open and breached all the time. There are things you can do to prevent that, but their facilities are not built to prevent access between their buildings. Many of those buildings in Florida. I visited Santana High School last week in Santee, California. They had a school shooting in 2001. All separate buildings, and the classroom doors were open to the outside. Mm-hmm. And when I say open, I'm telling you wide open.
Wow.
I rode up, got out of the car, got on the parking lot, and listen, I had my weapon on me and a badge. That the badge was covered, weapon was covered. They didn't know who I was, and they had doors open at a school that have already had a shooting. So this human complacency is our biggest threat. Not the fact that we don't have a plan. All schools have a plan. It's will they respond and will they act on it? That's where my para mindset comes in from the book.
Doc, it's fascinating when you hear a professional break it down where it sounds so simple. And it's usually that's the cause and effect of it. It's the things that you overlooked, that you didn't pay attention to, that we take for granted. And I love that it came from your mouth because it had so much weight towards it. Good, Doc, I can have you on all day long. Literally, you are one of my favorite guests we've had here on Outreach Radio Chicago. It is Dr. Stephen Webb. Check out the book, Education in a Violent World. Good, Doc, next time I talk to you, I have a lot of things that we need to hit on. We're going to definitely have you back on the show. One question, and then I want you to plug everything. All the time you've been working, this entire time that you've done the research, that you've been in law enforcement, that you've worked in the educational system, when you see these school shootings, when you've experienced a school shooting, what are some of the general thoughts that you hear from the students and the faculty that lived through it?
I can't believe it happened here. But let me tell you, one of the most telling parts of what I do is from my old cheerleading sponsor, Krista Kaiser, from when I was a boys basketball coach. Her son, Mason Kaiser, was shot in the Marshall County shooting. Mason still has a bullet in his neck. And when I talked to Krista and asked about how he was doing, what she told me was he's a very lucky kid. A quarter-inch difference, and we'd be having to bury him.
Jeez.
So you think about that. Everybody that's walking around our kids right now is that quarter-inch difference. The question is, are you going to act on it? Are you going to do something, or are you going to say, one person can't fix this? Because they can.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Stephen Webb here on Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Go to Amazon right now. You can check out the book, Education in a Violent World. Good, Doc, do you have anyone, anywhere, anything you're working on that you want to plug here in the fine city of Chicago or anywhere in the interweb that people can come support the awesome work that you're doing?
Well, I'm speaking in mostly education conferences now. I'm going to be in Huntsville tomorrow, and I'll be in Plant City, Florida this weekend. But I just did a show in Chicago in November. And listen, the people are great. They're working hard. These schools are doing a great job trying to harden those facilities. We need people like you getting the message out. The times have changed. It's time to change with them. And listen, I know that's tough, but it can happen. If all of us work together, we can make people understand these kids are not cattle. You don't herd them through gates. You nurture them through the world that they're living in.
You're a true gentleman. Dr. Stephen Webb, the book is Education in a Violent World. Check it out. Check out all his conferences. He's for sure going to be a guest back here on Outreach Radio Chicago. Doc, thank you so much, bud.
Oh, I appreciate it. You had great questions. This is a really great idea to put this out.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Today's episode deals with subjects in school violence, school shootings, and bullying. If you or anybody you know is thinking about harming themselves and you need somebody to talk to, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. Feel free to reach out to the show if you want to talk to us. We're at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at Mercado Airwaves @gmail.com. And again, the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. The subject is very sensitive, and we tried our best to make sure we kept that in mind as we did this episode. So with all that in mind, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the show. We'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at Mercado Airwaves @gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Hello and welcome into this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago. I'm your host, Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for making us a part of your day. Joining us today from Athletico is Tara Hackney, and she gives us a bunch of awesome information on how you can work out, stretch, and make sure you keep your body moving during these troublesome times during COVID-19, aka the coronavirus pandemic. We really hope that this information makes life a little bit easier, gives you a little bit of inspiration, and maybe some helpful hints on how you guys can stay active during these times. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our interview with Tara Hackney from Athletico. Coming up next here on Outreach Radio Chicago, I'm Mike Mercado. hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode, but before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy.
My name is Tara Hackney. I'm a physical therapist, and I work for Athletico Physical Therapy. I was lucky enough to live and work in Chicago for about 3 years, but I moved back home to Iowa, so that is where I am located now, about 2 years ago. I work in outpatient physical therapy, so not in the hospital, but out in the world, and we do a lot of post-op care, so hips and knees and shoulders, as well as therapy for those who have not had surgery and just trying to get them back to doing what they normally want to do in life.
So let's just say day to day, how have things changed? And let's say, I don't know, this whole global pandemic has happened. How has the life changed for Tara in what your day to day looked like before all this was happening?
Well, we've definitely had a slowdown in patients in the clinics, especially with doctors not doing surgeries or anything like that. And then we've been able to implement telehealth appointments for Athletico. So even though our clinics are open, since we're seeing less people physically coming into the clinic, we've been able to do like in-home treatments virtually. So we're able to connect over the secure internet feed, video feed, and then we can see patients and give the cueing and kind of continue their care so that they're not missing out on therapy, and they can do it at their homes.
So let's say somebody like you, for example, we're going to get into some awesome tricks and tips that you awesome people at Athletico have put together for, the person dealing with all this right now being in, shelter in place. But personally, when you're dealing with being a health professional and then you're seeing all the news that comes out, you're seeing all the fake news and all the science and, everything just being in one big melting pot. How does somebody like you or the community, when it comes to healthcare, how are you guys handling? What are some tips and tricks you can kind of give the audience in what you're seeing and how you're kind of dealing with the anxiety or dealing with the new pressures that we're dealing with in this post-COVID-19 world?
One of the biggest things that I've been doing personally to help myself with anxiety is taking a break from watching the news or scrolling social media. It can be like a rabbit hole where you can just kind of fall down it and you get stuck in it and you just kind of start to, go round and round and round. And I need to take a break. So that means like putting the phone down, turning off the TV. And for me, it is been nice with the weather getting warmer to get outside, either do some yard work, take the dog for a walk, just kind of get a little bit of that physical activity and movement, separate myself from the news.
The rabbit hole that is social media and mainstream news.
Yes.
Yeah. And speaking of that, being able to walk the dog, and, a lot of people have picked up different ways of working out. I remember, I was in college back in 2009, let's say, and P90X was the big craze. So we've gone through these movements of, in-house workouts, and it's not a novel idea. It's just we've been so spoiled now with cheap gym memberships and it just being kind of part of the day-to-day routine that's how you sell people on their health is, the convenience of it. But, nowadays, you could still do stuff at home and, something as simple as stretching to push-ups to a lot of different things. But you guys have kind of set up a program or at least bulletin points on how to do this. And one of the first ways to do it is clear up some space to work out. How important is that to maybe even just mentally or aesthetically to set up a space to work out, maybe being a big motivation to want to do it?
Well, I think it's similar to anything. Like you have to kind of have an area dedicated. So with a lot of people working from home, it's probably easier to work from home if you have a dedicated, like, this is where I work space. Helps get you in that mindset. So it's similar if you're trying to do a workout or kind of, either start a workout, change your workout. Having a space ready to do that is going to make you more likely to want to do it, as opposed to, I got to go clean the room first, and then I got to go do this. And it's really easy to find excuses to not do something. So if you already have that space ready to go and you have kind of in your living room or your bedroom or wherever you have place that you can remove shoes out of the way, don't make sure there's no cords that you're going to trip on, and have that kind of area dedicated, it's going to make it more likely and easier for you to go start that workout.
How many injuries have you seen due to something as simple as I stepped on a kid's Lego and I sprained my ankle? 15 minutes later, I'm in the hospital with a swelling in my knee. Like, how often do you see those stories?
Oh, like all the time, honestly. I was doing fine and the rolly toy rolled into my path, or the dog wanted some attention and you trip over them. It definitely happens. So being able to kind of like prevent that as much as possible. Like my dog, if I'm trying to work out, he's trying to be right there with me. And so I have to kind of put him in the other room or put him outside while I do a workout if I don't want him right there in the midst of everything.
We'll be right back with more Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado in just a moment. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode. But before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy. And speaking of dangers like that, and of course our furry friends, one thing that you can't prevent, though, is wearing the right equipment, making sure you're dressed properly, even if you're in the comforts of your own home. I know a lot of bro science, as they call it. You'll listen to Joe Rogan. He talks about, working out with his kettlebells or in his gym barefoot. And he has this whole bro science about why that works. But at the end of the day, he has a lot of money and can afford health insurance if some of a plate falls on it or whatnot, So how important is it to make sure you're wearing the right equipment, even if you're working out at home?
Yeah, so I would say, if you're used to doing a workout in running shoes or a certain pair of shoes or a certain outfit, I would continue to do that because that's how your body is used to doing it. That's going to prevent poor form, maybe you've had an ankle injury in the past, and so that you need a little bit more support for your ankles when you're doing squats or lunges or something like that. Still do that. Still wear the proper fitting shoes. That's going to decrease the risk of you awkwardly stepping on a Lego and falling off to the side if you have proper shoes on, or if you're ready to go wearing shorts or leggings or whatever, so you can move and do what you need to do.
Now, what about warming up and stretching? I think this is something that even before this pandemic hit, in general, people don't do a good job of stretching. They don't do a good job of making sure that they're loose and ready to do their 3 miles or, do their chest and arms that day. I think people just kind of want to go. We always think that we're going to stay 18 for our whole lives. How important is it to warm up, to stretch, to be as loose and keep your body as prepared as possible? So
the big thing with warming up, and kind of where a lot of people are moving to right now, is more focusing on a dynamic warm-up. So that could be as simple as, you walk around a little bit, you slowly start to get that heart rate up, you're starting to warm up those muscles, and then you're able to kind of move into high knees or butt kicks or some gentle lunging. And so you're getting ready to do the movements that your workout is going to be. So it's different than I'm going to sit on the floor with one leg out, bend over and hold that stretch. That's more of a static stretch. And that's actually been shown to be more beneficial at the end of a workout.
Oh, wow.
When you're already warm and almost as a cool down, where the dynamic warm up is more, moving through the range of motion, getting those muscles kind of ready to do what you're going to do.
No kidding. So there is different patterns to doing this too, right? So you're not just beholden to that old school mentality that we were taught in 7th grade gym.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of going against the grain a little bit. One thing I noticed, and one suggestion that I've seen a lot, and we see it a lot during these days, and even just during the social media age of these DIY projects, and one of them being using household products to create your own weight. Now, for me personally, I've always just had my own sets of weights or any type of activity I want to do. But this is something people do. They use bags, they use different types of, ingenuity to make their own home workouts.
Yeah. So, obviously you were saying not as many people maybe have home gyms anymore. We've been kind of spoiled and we've been able to go to the gym and they have all the weights and kettlebells and medicine balls and anything you could really want. At home, you're going to be a little bit more limited, especially if you don't already have weights at home. So people have been able to use, a full water bottle, an average size water bottle full of water is a pound. So, certain arm exercises, maybe all you need is 1 pound. Cans of food can also be about a pound. Other things like a gallon, so if you put a gallon of water, that's more like 8 pounds. So you can kind of make it work in a way, but the other thing is you want to make sure that it's going to be secure and it's not going to shift on you in the middle of a workout or the lid's going to pop off and then all of a sudden you have water going everywhere, things like that. So there's definitely ways to add resistance at home with household items, but obviously you want to make sure that you're doing it properly. Sometimes the weighted backpacks, if people are doing that, like if you're wearing it on your back, that's going to shift your weight further to the back, which could maybe alter your mechanics when you're doing squats or when you're doing lunges. And then you see people doing the opposite, where they'll almost wear the weight on the front, and it's the same thing. Then your weight center of gravity and whatnot is going to be shifted forward. So it's not like a perfect system, but it would give you something.
Would you call somebody, or would you maybe look for the advice from a doctor, or if you were going to do something like that, especially if you've sustained any type of prior injury?
In what way?
Like, let's say, like, I called you, like, yeah, let's just say I'm like, hey, we're stuck here in COVID-19. I have nothing. I'm about to put 2 cases of Chef Boyardee in my backpack. Is that okay if I just came off of, sciatic nerve problems or whatnot? Should I be looking for the advice of doctors when it comes to something like this during a pandemic?
Just depends kind of, I guess, on where you're at. I wouldn't ramp up to it right away. I would probably ease into it and see, can I do it without any resistance? And that felt okay. Give yourself a day or two to like really assess recovery and soreness levels. If that's okay, maybe start with 1.
I think people underestimate how heavy their body really is. So, like, let's say even if you're 170 pounds, how heavy that is to do push-ups. Do 50 push-ups at 170 pounds. It's still a lot. That's a lot of resistance. So I guess
you'll still get stronger.
Yeah, so I guess that was kind of where I'm going with this. I think naturally people always want to just add on weight because that's the whole goal in the gym, is to add weight. To you see the growth and you see the progression in your system, but you could do a lot of stuff just with your natural body weight.
Oh, yes, for sure. And there's so many exercises you can do with just body weight, and that don't need equipment, and that you can just do at home. You don't even need to get creative with anything. Like push-ups is one, planks, squats, lunges. I mean, a lot of times people at the gyms and stuff, you'll see people doing resisted or weighted squats, weighted lunges, but you can get a workout without adding weight. You just might have to do more reps, and that would help with your endurance maybe a little bit more than like building up muscle.
We'll be right back with more Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado in just a moment.
We hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode. But before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at Mike M Media. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy. Being in tune with your body, how important is it to listen to your body, to listen to the aches, to listen to the pains, listen to when it's time to slow the engine down? A lot of us always want to go 100 miles an hour. A lot of us who ever played sports, men and women, are competitive, and you want that drive. You want to be better than the day before. How important is it to listen to your body, to take the right amount of time off, and to also not get complacent and know when it's time to maybe ramp it up a little bit?
Yeah, so I always say, if you're able to do a workout and you don't have any fatigue at the end, or if you're not even maybe just a little bit sore, like I always call it like the jello leg feeling, like you're tired at the end of a workout. If you're not feeling that, it's probably time to up some part of it. On the flip side, a lot of people still like the slogan, no pain, no gain. And to some respect, that is not correct, because when you're having pain, depending on the type of pain, that's the body's way of saying something's not right. So you need to be aware of that and kind of listen to your body. If you're getting sharp pains doing anything, it's probably time to back off, kind of maybe reassess, see if there's a way that, you could do it better, you could modify, you can make it slightly easier, and try to find a way to not have that pain. Now, flip side of that, if you're sore, achiness, that's a normal response to working out. So that's a different type of pain. So that is normal. It's just the sharp pain that's your body's way of saying something's not right.
For any of the great listeners of Chicago who are maybe looking into getting into a health regimen, to getting into working out, especially during this time, is there a way that you can kind of tell the difference? I mean, I personally can, obviously, but not everybody has been playing sports and exercising throughout these years. Let's say, can you explain the difference between an injury and, let's say, soreness and whatnot? Kind of a general from what you've seen over your experience for the average house mom or dad who are finally getting into riding their mountain bike and doing some P90X or DDP yoga?
In general, like muscle soreness that happens after a workout, generally, it's after a workout. It's not during it, but after a workout, between 24 to 48 hours after a workout, you will feel achy, you'll feel sore, might get some stiffness in the joints, and that's your body's way of adjusting to something new. So even if you've been working out, but maybe you tried something different, something new to your routine, you might still have some soreness because different muscles got worked in a different manner than they're used to. And an injury kind of instance, sometimes we have injuries where you can point to a certain time, certain event that happened, and you're like, that's when I got hurt. An ankle sprain is kind of an example of that. You can kind of point to it and say, I rolled my ankle then, and that's when it started hurting. Other injuries can happen over time. For example, like a tendinitis type of injury kind of is from repetition. It can happen gradually. It can happen over time. Sometimes in a tendinitis type of situation, you get kind of the pain afterwards, after working out, but it gets better. And eventually you'll get pain during the exercise and afterwards. And if it gets bad enough, you get pain all the time. So kind of paying attention to where is the pain, how long is it lasting, is it sore, is it sharp, dull, constant, does it change with movement or change with activities? All of those are going to give you a little bit more insight into, is this just regular soreness after a workout, or is it maybe something else going on? Are able to do kind of virtual assessments right now at Athletico Clinic, so that could also be an option.
And how is that going? Really fast, we're up against the clock, but how has that been for you as it changed through this virtual world now? Everything's through Zoom, everything's through Skype. You know, it's kind of nice we have the technology, and we've been eased into it, but how are you kind of handling all this? How has it been in this new frontier?
Well, there was definitely a learning curve, but I think we've all kind of been able to really jump in and just kind of get going with it right away. And we're able to continue to see our patients and give them the help and the care that we normally would give them in the clinic. We're able to do that virtually, but still be able to see our patients, which is, I think, is a really nice aspect of it. And patients seem to be enjoying it as well.
Tara Hackney, we can talk to you all day. As always, the awesome team at Athletico are doing some amazing stuff to try to help out the community. Hopefully next time we talk, it'll be you in town so we can all have some beef sandwiches and hot dogs and pizza and celebrate the Chicago way when we send you back to Iowa. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Please follow me all over social media. I'm on Twitter at Mike M Media and on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. We'll see you next time here on Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We hope you're enjoying this episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. We'll get right back into today's episode, but before we do that, we'd like to remind you to please follow us on Twitter at MikeMMedia. You can also see what we're doing outside of Outreach Radio Chicago by following us on Twitter at Mercado Airwaves. You can like us on Facebook at Mercado Airwaves and at Outreach Radio Chicago. Subscribe to the program on YouTube, youtube.com/Mike Mercado 2333. Listen to past episodes of Outreach Radio Chicago, interviews we've done with athletes and celebrities, and so much more wherever you get your favorite podcasts by searching Mercado Airwaves. And while you're at it, please do us a huge favor, like, rate, review, and share the shows. Want to hear us talk about a certain subject? Email us at outreachradiochicago@gmail.com or at mercadoairwaves@gmail.com. You can see what we're up to behind the scenes by following me on Instagram at Mike Mercado Media. Thank you guys so much for all the support. Let's get back to today's episode of Outreach Radio Chicago with Mike Mercado. Enjoy.